Okay. Will the camera find me now? Well done, camera.
Yeah.
All right. So we're a minute past the hour. So I figure let's keep to our schedule, which we've been really good with, and we will get on with our keynote. So I will not do an extended introduction, but I will just say that when we were talking about doing our AI Literacies event, I remembered in my head, it's like, oh yeah, I know that Mark across the road just wrote a book about AI and academics. And, we're thinking about AI literacy, both in the sense of, again, developing tools for external engagement, but also thinking about, just like the wider context of academic literacy around, like how we understand AI and all this kind of stuff. But obviously, it's something important that, we need to reflect back on how we do our jobs, the context for what we're doing in our jobs as academics, which is important not just to us, but to people who interact with the university system in many different ways as well. So there's all kinds of questions that are really relevant, and I was excited to get Mark in to talk about these. So I will let you introduce yourself in a little bit more detail, but thank you for agreeing to do a keynote for our AI Literacies Day.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm slightly confused by how Copilot changed.
Yeah. So what I need to do is this.
Cool.
Share the screen, and then now I think that should be good.
Yeah, is that good on Teams?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't be at the first part of the day, because this sounded like it was much more interesting than what I was doing. But that last panel was fascinating, and thinking about the political economy of this feels really important to me. I have a very split perception and experience of generative AI because I have a split role. On the one hand, I'm an academic technologist, and with that hat on, I do think it's very exciting. I think there are deeply creative, intellectually enriching ways we can use LLMs. But as a critical sociologist and social theorist, I think we're all doomed. And the common connection between the two is the question of context. Because I think we can, as academics, and I think our students can, as learners, use these LLMs as really enriching tools. But the context militates against them. And in that sense, I don't think the problem is intrinsic to the LLM, but what happens when the affordances of the LLM meet the context within which we're doing research and in which teaching and learning is taking place. And so I want to talk a bit about that today and think about it in terms of what I see as a crisis of trust, and the way in which that crisis predates the LLM is amplified by the diffusion of these technologies, and also what we might do about it, particularly as we work with our students. But to start, I'd like to just share an example which I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the last year. This was just about a year ago. On a Sunday morning, before I'd had my coffee, I made the mistake of picking up my phone, as we do, looking at my email. And the first thing I read was this very aggressively framed legal letter saying that they were taking legal action because I violated copyright in a post I used on my blog. I blog a lot, so there's probably 6,500 posts on there. And so it's very possible that I had inadvertently infringed someone's copyright with an image I used. And so I went to make the coffee feeling very unsettled by the tone of this email. I came back, started looking at the website of the firm. This is City Legal, a Boston-based law firm dedicated to legal excellence. A bland but seemingly legitimate website. And this was Anne Brown, who had sent me the email that I received that morning. It seemed like a very big firm. And then when I started to look at the blog, I realized actually something was a bit off about this. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But as content marketing goes, you can't really see how this would add to the appeal of a legitimate law firm. It's very bland, it's very generic, but still I wasn't sure what exactly the problem was. Then, as the caffeine started to kick in and I regained the critical faculties that I'm now trying to demonstrate, I started to realize that actually I know what a DMCA notice looks like. That is a DMCA notice. This is not a DMCA notice. And from past experience, as someone who's done stuff online for a very long time, I understood that the goes to the web host, not the content producer. I double checked the image and found it was from Unsplash, a royalty-free image website. So clearly I wasn't violating someone's copyright. And what was most obviously problematic was that they were asking me to insert a URL into my post, not to take down the offending image, but to insert a URL. to Zodiac Casino. And at that point, clearly something about this is very, very wrong. And so the legal section of the letter was nonsense. And then when I started looking for City Legal, the only thing I could find was their website. And, law firms by definition do newsworthy things. And so it was really strange that City Legal did not exist apart from City Legal's website. So I started looking more closely and wanting to investigate Anna, who sent me this email. She's a specialist in corporate legal affairs, which I know nothing about the law, but just kind of general common sense. That does not sound like a very convincing phrase for someone to describe the work they do as a lawyer. I then searched for another Boston-based lawyer as a comparator. I just typed in Boston-based lawyer. Victoria Mayer is the first person who came up, and you can see the substantive, careful description, which does just speak of expertise in a way that Anna Brown's specialism in corporate legal matters doesn't. So at this point, I'm clear that this is fraud of some sort, but I now I'm more curious than anything else about what it is. I checked the domain name. It's not a US domain, and it was registered in Iceland in December 2023. Maybe there is some elaborate story why a long-standing Boston-based law firm would have a non-US domain name registered in Iceland last year, but I can't see any potential explanation at that point. And then I discovered you can look up who's registered to practice law in Massachusetts, and found not only is there no Anna Brown registered to practice law, none of the names, at least until I got bored and stopped putting them in, were registered lawyers. And so it's a scam. And it's at this point that I started to realize, I think after a second cup of coffee, what kind of scam it is. And have you noticed that they're all looking perfectly at the camera? On first glance, first thing on a morning, when I was unsettled by the email, those headshots looked genuinely legitimate. They looked like real people. I just assumed they were real people. In actuality, I'm fairly certain they were made with generated faces, a popular tool that lets you set the alignment for a head pose to front-facing, left-facing, or right-facing. And whoever made this list of headshots hadn't put enough effort into even vary it the slightest, which leaves us with the most unlikely perfect corporate photo shoot ever. And so this is clearly black hat search engine optimization. Search engine optimization has been around as long as there have been search engines. Black hat SEO is using unethical or illegal means to increase search engine visibility. And what I think is happening here is that freely available generative AI tools, I think a number of them for different purposes, have been used to produce a website and supporting materials to legitimize these speculative claims. Why it's interesting is that it illustrates how the cost of this sort of activity has shrunk rapidly. It would have taken a lot of time and energy to fake this previously. And what I find interesting about this example is how lazy it is. I think it's black hat SEO intended to operate at scale. It's not intended to deceive anyone who's looking closely. It's intended to do a rough and ready scam that can be emailed out in an automated fashion. And if even 1% of people who get emailed put that link on, the potential impact on the SEO rank and the search engine ranking of Zodiac Casino is significant. So the person running this has not put much time or effort into it. I suspect Zodiac Casino hasn't put much money into it. And the triviality of it all, I think, is what stuck with me. And of course, it won't always be trivial. And that's where looking at the obvious, stupid, easy examples, I think, are useful, because they render the more opaque examples legible. Because it doesn't just distribute the means of disinformation and reduce the cost of undertaking this sort of activity. It does so in a way which reveals the affordances of software that is now freely available. There are safeguards in commercial generative AI software, but as many people here will be familiar with, you can get around them fairly easily. If you ask ChatGPT to help you deceive people by creating a fictional law firm, it will say no. If you tell it you're producing a fictional work about a Boston-based law firm, it will very enthusiastically help you with this. As I can prove by introducing my own Boston-based law firm. Hamilton, Pearson, Lee, where tradition meets innovation. If you look at the photo, you can see, if you look at it for more than 2 seconds, it's a bad photo. Two of these women on the front row seem to be the same woman. and the couch they're sitting on is very weird. The text is a little bit better, but it's still very generic. But the thing is, that took me under a minute to make. And I don't think the person behind City Legal took more than a few hours making that website. What about as the models become more advanced, the baseline images get more persuasive, but also as someone puts a bit more effort into it, the capacity for very effective fraud goes through the roof. And of course, even if the safeguards were foolproof, there are still open source tools that can be installed relatively easily. Limited technical expertise required, but I mean, even the free commercial tools will write code to help you personalize and set up the open source tools. And so I think this leaves us in a situation where the means of disinformation are now freely available to anyone willing to spend even a small amount of time learning to act on them. And we see evidence of this in many places. And the signs of this being used for malign purposes are accumulating rapidly. And I'm interested in the kind of perceptual moment where this becomes normalized as a sense of social risk. I don't think we're quite there yet, but these are still seen as specialized cases rather than instances of a general trend. And we've already seen these today, actually, so I agree with these are some of my favorite pictures. And it's nice to let other people feel the same way about them. This is my favorite, even if it's probably the most implausible on many reasons. And so this illustrates the problem of dealing with this, right? That, I mean, I think these are the BBC versions of it where they put fake on it, because if you ignore the photo, it still circulates. But just putting fake on it diminishes the power of the image. And so we're in a very complex situation. And I wanted to start with this just to give a sense of how we might think of the wider context, a context in which, so I didn't catch your name, but I really enjoyed the talk earlier. Yeah, and as you were pointing out earlier, the kind of way in which trust is going to change as we grapple with this. And so trust in UK society on mainstream quantitative measures is already very low. Trust across Europe and the US has been collapsing. I don't know the data more globally, but I think it would be interesting to understand that. And there is this new mechanism that I think is very likely to drive a precipitous decline in trust in the near future, particularly given a reliance on digital media to, kind of act in social life. And so we're in a context where there's very little social trust and it's going to decline rapidly. And that would be bad in its own right, but I want to argue there's a parallel crisis of trust taking place in universities. And so the launch of ChatGPT in November 2022, which, let us remember is less than 3 years ago. I think we're kind of 2.5 years into that. Sparks a wave of fascination and fear about the disruptive potential. And there are real problems here, and I don't mean to diminish or deny those problems. But there was also what I've termed in my work a great assessment panic that was sparked. And there was a tendency to immediately see this in terms of students using generative AI to cheat, which is a very reductive framing of the problem. And the preoccupation with assessment integrity, I would argue, diverted attention away from a much broader and more complicated set of structural challenges posed by generative AI. And there have been short-sighted responses, which I guess in some circumstances might be necessary. So if there's a pressing pedagogical reason why you need to preserve an essay-based assignment, you probably do need to return to in-person assessment. We need to be attendant to the equity and logistical challenges involved in that. I mean, exams privilege certain ways of relating to the world and certain sets of past experience over others. But that sense of just propping up our existing way of doing things diverts us from trying to look at what does this mean for the organization of teaching, learning, and research within higher education, because that propping up is going to crumble with time. And the way in which this debate has played out makes it hard to go forward on that basis. This is a letter in The Guardian from a few days ago, which I thought captured what I would see as a pervasive, if not necessarily dominant mood amongst academics within universities. And I'd be really interested to hear kind of how this resonates with your perceptions of colleagues. But this sense of universities, university work now involving much of my time suspecting students of using AI to write essays. I would estimate that a good half of the written work I see has had some AI input. I genuinely think some of these students don't realize it's cheating. And I think it's really important that we can push back on some of the claims that are in common circulation here. And I hear this a lot. I know that my students are cheating. Well, how do you know? And there's a sense of being powerless. And I think it's important that we take the emotional valence of that very, very seriously, while gently pushing back on some of the factual claims. Because there is a sense of crisis, there is a sense that things aren't working. And just anecdotally, I do wonder if we are going to see people taking early retirement. And I know a few examples of this, because once you can, if you've got a few years left in your career, it's just going to be a lot of work to kind of relearn a lot of what we've done in the past. And as the author says, this is now the bizarre reality of higher education. And it is a bizarre reality. As someone said earlier, like it's weird. Like it's a weird set of processes we're entering into. But I think we have to tread very, very carefully here. LLM use by students is clearly widespread. HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, did a study recently with a good representative sample that suggested we've gone from 47% to 12% of students who say they never use LLMs in assessments in any way. And so how indicative this is a broader question. And while I think the kind of constant accumulation of small and medium-sized projects on empirical evidence of LLMs is maybe not the best way of handling this, we do have a lot of data now that suggests rapid growth of the use of LLMs by students. And I would suggest, and it's a slightly dispiriting argument, that any sense that we can kind of just get students to stop using this, like that was never tenable, but at this stage, we've really just got to forget that. And the question becomes how they're using it rather than whether they're using it. And how we could do that without normalizing the LLM, I think, is a huge challenge. But on a purely learning development and pedagogy side of things, I just don't think we can ignore this. And I think the attempt to kind of push back stops us from responding to the practical challenges. Because I think we're entering into a really dangerous situation. And again, I'd love to hear to what extent these claims resonate with your experience. I think when I write this up, I'm going to try and use these claims to catalogue some of the many, many small empirical projects that are circulating around this. But in essence, my perception is we're entering a kind of multi-dimensional crisis of trust within universities. Academics don't trust students. I thought this piece gave a really powerful articulation of something that I feel I've encountered a lot. I once believed my students and I were in this together, engaged in a shared intellectual pursuit, and that fate has been obliterated. I could say, as some of my colleagues do, that I trust all my students, but I can't. And I don't mean to mock it, I really don't, because as someone very interested in psychoanalytic theory, what stood out to me about that was the kind of powerful sense of something lost. That sense that we were once in this together, we had a shared intellectual pursuit. Really? Did you really feel that? Like, I don't think you did, but kind of that sense in which we feel we've lost something, what we have lost becomes a kind of glittering, transcendent object. Everything was fine until this bad thing came along. It's a form of populist reason. It's the idea that everything was fine. Some outside element has come in and it's ruined it. And if only we can get rid of this outside element, then things will be fine. I think there's a sort of magical thinking about the technology which is circulating that is very dangerous. But also, students don't trust academics. And until recently, I was a program director for a large PGT program. We had a big teaching team. And I think I was starting to see aspects of this. And there's evidence online that this is beginning to develop. I don't have the data, and this is where I've looked, and I can't find any interesting data about this. So if anyone has any suggestions, I'd love to read them. But I think it's plausible that to the extent students feel that academics are saying, don't use this, it's bad, and students see evidence that academics are themselves using it, that is a recipe for students not trusting academics. As the student interviewed in this piece says, he's telling us not to use it, and then he's using it himself. So this is not good. If I'm right, the trust of academics in students is declining. The trust of students in academics is declining. But it gets worse because students don't trust students. And I've certainly seen evidence of this in my own program leadership and teaching. And the psychological mechanism here is very plausible. If you see other people as doing something that you think is bad, but they're getting a competitive advantage, there comes a point where you start to say to yourself, well, I just might do it anyway. And this is how kind of moral commitments erode over time. And so I'm worried that students are starting to not trust students, and also staff don't trust each other as well. I'm not sure if anyone's seen what seems to be a increasingly common claim on social media, where someone gets a bad peer review and says they've had a ChatGPT generated peer review. And my point is not that they're necessarily wrong. It's the epistemic claim, how do you know? And the certainty which tends to accompany these claims. It's the same sensation you get when you talk to somebody who says, I know my students used AI. And you ask them how, and they say, oh, it just feels a bit artificial. And that's what's so corrosive. So while I do think these perceptions are things we should critique, I think we need to take the feeling very, very seriously. There's a mood of inauthenticity entering into academic life. There's a sense that other people aren't fully participating, that other people are trying to get ahead using the new technology that's available. And I think that's a very complex thing. I think there's a lot of anxiety still circulating after the pandemic. I think the conditions of academic work have changed. There's less face-to-face work. There's still a lot of grief and trauma attached to the pandemic. And under those conditions, the sense in which things all just feel different, things don't feel quite the same way. The spectre of generative AI as a kind of organizing force entering into the picture, I think is increasingly doing some kind of very complex psychological work. And it's very difficult to find a balancing act between, on the one hand, not accepting this, because I think it's really important that we don't uncritically accept some of the claims being made, but also not dismissing it, not taking that kind of classically critical stance and said, well, it's really this. I think to kind of do some healing around this, we have to kind of create spaces where this anxiety can be shared. And this means distinguishing between the real problems and the paranoia that surrounds them. I use paranoia here in a very specific, like, not glib sense of kind of Eve Sedgwick's distinction between criticality and paranoia. I wrote a paper about paranoia in EdTech. If anyone's interested, I can send that along. I just want to be clear that I'm not using it in a kind of idiomatic sense. And so I think there are real and powerful challenges raised by generative AI. And the assessment integrity issue is real. I think there is a plausible scenario in which trust that degrees represent real learning could completely break down. And there are worrying signs of how that might already be beginning to happen. And employer confidence is going to be a driver of that. The graduate premium has collapsed. And so if the graduate premium has collapsed, if the teaching and learning experience is declining, and if employers don't see any value in the degree, why would people do this? And so I think uptake of higher education could decline precipitously. And so there's a real existential challenge to higher education here. I sincerely believe that. I just think how we respond to it has to be very careful, because there's a paranoia that impedes how we respond to it. The obsessing over detection, treating all AI use as cheating, and the risk of moving into a surveillance culture. Because I think when we act in a paranoid mode, we don't just misidentify the problem, we risk making poor decisions. So treating international students as suspects, it was the extent to which UK universities have been critical and cautious about AI detection is really reassuring in this sense, because AI detectors are prone to picking up the syntactical features of writing in a second language. International students will get penalized if AI detectors become commonly used. Students who are using it for efficiency, students who have a full-time job or a series of part-time jobs, students with caring responsibilities. If we treat AI use as somehow intrinsically problematic by students, really understandable and beneficial uses to kind of make work easier to manage alongside other commitments could be risk being caught in the net. First generation students who lack academic cultural capital. And so if you talk to academics about things they see as signs of generative AI use, they'll often talk about a lack of fluency or a sense of artificiality or a misuse of technical terms. And these can be a sign of an LLM, but they can also be a sign of someone who's new to academia and is negotiating what sociologists of education call a lack of cultural capital in an environment that demands it. And so the red flags approach, which ultimately, if we're trying to manage this, is the only set of tactics available. You look for fallible indicators of AI use, and then you add them up and you make a judgment on the balance of possibilities, which is provisional. We do need things like malpractice reviews, and I think red flags are ultimately all we have for that. But red flags can be penalizing very, very easily. And so we're ultimately dealing with challenges that aren't entirely new. Essay mills have been around for decades, and I think it's interesting to reflect on how the web made essay mills into the problem they were. This was a digitally driven structural challenge to assessment integrity we've dealt with for a long time. Because although there have always been people writing essays for students for pay, it was only the web that enabled buyers and sellers to meet in marketplaces. And so digital disruption of assessment is not new. But I think what has changed is the scale of it, the ease of it, and the sense of a broader crisis. Because the pandemic aspect of this is increasingly a fixation for me. If you see the disruptions taking place to teaching, learning, research, other operations within higher education, from March 2020 to November 2022, by the time ChatGPT was released, a sense of normalcy had just started to enter into many people's experience. For some people, that experience wasn't there. But for many people, there was a sense that normal life was returning to higher education. And then ChatGPT hit. And I think the kind of overblown moral panic that emerged, rather than a sober accounting for what was this, what will the implications be, I suggest should be interpreted in terms of the fallout of the pandemic. It's like, oh God, we thought things were normal again, and now something else massively disruptive is happening. And this would all be a problem, a huge problem, if the UK university system was in good shape. But it's not. And I think the most salient element to understand the crisis of generative AI is the financial crisis in UK higher education. And the spending review suggests that's going to get worse before it gets better. And the government is clearly committed to letting at least one or two institutions fail to prove a point to the sector. So we're in a situation where courses are being closed, compulsory redundancies have jumped to 25% in 1 year, and those remaining will face impossible workloads and deteriorating conditions. And I find Microsoft Copilot sinister for many reasons, but one is that Copilot agents are clearly going to be used to try and automate some of the processes which job losses are making untenable. And so we're going to see a wave of automation driven by LLMs in higher education, which is just going to cause chaos, because I think you could use these things quite effectively for automation. If you had a well-staffed learning organization where people can design and iterate, but if you're doing it just because you're running out of money, it's going to be a disaster. And I think everyone can feel that work in higher education is getting worse. It's becoming a less nice way to make a living, and that's going to grow over time. But these challenges are complex and structural. And there's a tendency that some people can easily fall into of just kind of seeing the LLM as the problem, rather than seeing the LLM as a vector through which broader crises are unfolding. And so what I'm trying to say is that the context for this transformation wasn't created by AI, and the technology is amplifying existing fractures, which is not to say that the problem is just a capitalist university, although in a sense it is, but rather to take questions of practice and policy and insist that we contextualize them in terms of this wider crisis, and to think very carefully about how we attribute responsibility in the process. Because I'm convinced we are entering into a situation where LLMs have diffused incredibly rapidly as a piece of consumer software. I think you can't say they're just software, but I think in a sense we are mostly talking about software here, and that can deflate the way we construct these debates. The growth on mobile has increased significantly, and how we relate to apps on the mobile tends to be very different to web apps on a desktop. We have a more intimate relationship with the mobile. We sometimes think less about what we do on a mobile phone. And I think it was obvious this was going to happen. And there's a tendency to see a lack of criticality towards LLMs as enabling the diffusion. The diffusion didn't happen because we were insufficiently critical about LLMs. The diffusion happened because the most powerful corporations in the world pinned their entire economic future on the diffusion. And the extent to which digital capitalism was in crisis before ChatGPT was launched can't be overstated. There was a retrenchment in big tech that they hadn't seen since the dot-com crash. The firms were laying off thousands of staff, and they've reinflated themselves using this. So this was always going to diffuse. And I think that's probably a bad thing on balance. But I also don't think it's something we had any control over. I think a political project to prevent that diffusion was not going to be tenable. And so I think how we respond in higher education needs to start from the fact of the diffusion. And that doesn't mean normalizing LLMs, but it does mean starting from the assumption that our students, I think, are likely to be using them, and our colleagues are increasingly likely to be using them as well. The extent to which this is being built into Copilot, which I think is a horrendous piece of software, but even if it wasn't, the notion that you template these LLM actions so people press buttons to do stuff rather than thinking about what they want to write a prompt, I think is actively very dangerous. Because I think this is still visible at the moment, and I'm very interested in the kind of claims in philosophy and sociology of technology about how things that are new or things that are broken become legible to us. And generative AI, LLMs, are still very, very much visible. They are very much legible. But once they become part of our software, as well as our mobile devices, it will become increasingly difficult to see it and reflect on it. We're seeing significant shifts in practices already, and they can be an object of curiosity or frustration or fascination. Increasingly on an email list, a national email list this morning, I saw someone who left the prompt in at the start of their email. And things like this still happen. We see things getting published, admittedly much more in predatory journals than others, where someone has left the ChatGPT as of my last knowledge cutoff date in. And it's terrible, right? But this is not that peer review was working well until this came along. It's revealing a problem that was already there. And my concern is that we have this moment of deciding what to do before it becomes like the water we swim in, or the Copilot 365, which we're forced to use for core university functions. And while we can still take it as an object that is novel and broken and something we should be critical about, I think we do have an opportunity. And that's why I think we need to think carefully about what's coming in this next academic year. There's a case to be made that we shouldn't use LLMs. I mean, the environmental argument for that is the most persuasive. But if we're talking about policy and practice within universities, I've never thought that was a tenable response to the challenges within higher education, and I feel more strongly about that than ever. My own view of LLM use has become much more conflicted in terms of my personal use over time, just because of how this is building up into a kind of global computational superstructure. But in terms of how we respond, we can't outrun it within higher education. I don't think we can prohibit it effectively and without inculcating a really dangerous surveillance culture. So what that leaves is how we steer it, I would argue, and how we steer it in thoughtful rather than thoughtless directions, to use it as a tool for thinking rather than a substitute for thought. And I think doing that involves dealing with the kind of relational damage that's already been done in higher education. And it means thinking more carefully about what we're doing with the LLMs. And so to move away from the idea that we use it or don't use it, and instead develop a much more nuanced vocabulary for thinking about modes of use and patterns of use. So for example, for academic use, using it to bypass peer review versus using it to clarify complex ideas. Some relationships preserve scholarly judgment, and I think that's the key thing, that we're still making judgments, we're still reflecting. And some replace it using it as a ghostwriter or a credibility manufacturer. And empirically, I think we need to better understand these relational practices and at the level of policy, we need to not just police the outputs. And this was an interesting piece of research done by Anthropic, who developed Claude, where they're now doing research on use of LLMs, and the capacity of firms to do real-time research on their own user base is fascinating, but also deeply worrying in some respects. And in this case, the users they catalog as students, they categorize the use in terms of Bloom's taxonomy of creating, evaluating, analyzing, applying, understanding, and remembering. And so what I find worrying about that is that the biggest use by students is creating, and I think creating is the most dangerous. So even if it's create an outline or create a small piece of text, the likelihood that students using LLMs for creating work involves cognitive outsourcing is quite high. Won't always be the case. But when it comes to analyzing, and particularly when it comes to understanding, I don't think there's anywhere near as much of a risk of cognitive outsourcing. There still can be. But none of these practices necessarily lead to one outcome or the other. I think they all contain a balance of possibilities about what the deleterious effects for the student will be. And I would suggest that this is the level on which we need to proceed, of getting beyond thinking about LLMs or not, and focusing much more strongly and substantively on exactly what uses we are making of them. Sorry. Excuse me. So I think there are reasons to be pessimistic, but I do see ways in which we can respond constructively to this in terms of academic use, student use. I think the cultural politics of technology make these conversations more difficult than they would otherwise be. I feel very conflicted about the cultural politics. A few weeks ago, I was told that I was completely uncritical of LLMs in one event, and then the next day, I was told off for being too negative about LLMs. Like, partly that's whether I've got the academic technologist or the sociologist hat on, but partly it is also because we have this split, because it's such an evocative cultural object. How we position ourselves in relation to it takes on a lot of significance. And the kind of conceptually guided practical reasoning involved in teaching and learning and in learning design and development becomes much harder in those circumstances. But I think we can do this. I mean, the fact higher education, teaching and learning persisted during the pandemic gives a sense that we can, because I think in many ways this is a much smaller problem than how to deliver effective teaching during the pandemic was. And so I was feeling optimistic, but then something happened last weekend that kind of sent me off in the other direction again. This is a book that I picked up in the Tate Modern Bookshop last Sunday when I was in London. And because I've been thinking a lot about trust recently, it just immediately stood out to me, trust, building on the cultural commons. Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to think about. I opened the book and I saw this lovely quote from bell hooks on the first page. Trust is both a personal and a political endeavor, and a collective potential for growth and transformation. And that immediately resonated. I thought, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. That's exactly the intuition that I'm trying to articulate. There's been a crisis of trust, but we can rebuild it. But to rebuild it, we have to see it as a collective undertaking defined by a commitment to values. And so I thought, yeah, I'm going to buy this book, started reading it on the train home. And I wanted to use this quote. So there was no citation in the book, worryingly. And so I started searching for it online. And when I searched for it on the train home, despair, head in hands, because I discovered bell hooks didn't say this. ChatGPT said this.
No.
This is a web page. It's a lovely exercise, actually. This is a web page in which someone has asked ChatGPT for what would these philosophers say about the question, what is trust? Nietzsche's in there, Schopenhauer's in there, and bell hooks is in there. The author of this book, I assume, and there might be more charitable interpretations, but I struggle to think of them. And the author of this book, I assume, decided it would look good to have a quote by bell hooks on the first page. Type bell hooks trust into Google. This is the second result. Didn't read any of it, skimmed to the point where he saw bell hooks, copied and pasted it and put it in the book. And so I was feeling optimistic until this point, but actually, maybe we're all doomed. Because the book is really interesting, but kind of 50 pages in when I found this, I don't want to read this anymore. And a book about trust, and I no longer trust anything in it. And that is grim, right? And so in that sense, I think it's not just an educational crisis. I think it's an epistemological crisis. Like that might sound overblown, but it left me with this sense of, I'm trying to find the kind of practical, hopeful response here and think about what we can do. And it just left me the sense that we're standing on quicksand, that the infrastructure of knowledge is changing more rapidly than we can respond to it. And I do fully understand the inclination to despair under those circumstances. But I think conversely, what we do now really matters because I think it's not really plausible to give up. And I also think we have a responsibility to our students. My sense is our students feel a great deal of anxiety about generative AI, not just in higher education, but what it means in their future. Universities have done a really bad job of communicating what we expect from them in relation to generative AI. And if we don't kind of sustain a hopeful attitude here, I think we sell our students short, amongst other things. So I think we need to be pragmatic. I think we need a kind of political economy literacy, which is why I really want to read more about that when you work on the project. We need to link this to the broader transformation of society and higher education without just saying, oh, it's capitalism, nothing we can do. We need to find ways to work together. So I hope there's a balance here, because I do think there are reasons to be a bit bleak, but the question, kind of classically, what is to be done? So yeah, thank you.
You can press, it should be like a button to stop sharing.
That's the thing.
Oh, it'll do that, then just to that bar.
That's the building. Did we share it?
So it's the second from the right.
Oh,
There.
Yeah, I also find it incredibly confusing.
that's an understatement. Amazing. Questions? From the room and from people on TV.
Thank you, it's brilliant. I think it gets part of certainly what my conversation with the I've not thought about it, trust that we'll start doing that. Really gets that. But should we cross ChatGPT?
No, I don't think so. Like, I think that something I've noticed recently of students having an almost kind of oracular relationship to it, which I think I understand, where I think we need to get students to trust it less, actually. Psychologically, it's very loaded, right? That this magic system that can answer any question confidently and fluently, that there's something reassuring about that. And I love that phrase earlier of why use mind when have chat.
Why use brain when have chat?
Yeah, why use brain when have chat? And so, kind of human beings under certain circumstances can be lazy. And that sense of, well, why would we do it when we could never compete with its wisdom? We could never compete with its knowledge. I think that's really dangerous. And so, yeah, I think we should be challenged to trust it less. And also, just as a general message to everyone, don't ask it factual questions. Like, that's kind of AI literacy 101. And yet, this is still very frequent that we ask factual questions to LLMs, and we certainly need to stop our students from doing it.
Thank you, that was fascinating. In regards to this crisis of trust, are you looking at this, really specifically from a sort of UK context? Just, I'm thinking that, I'm head of international arts and humanities here, so I go to a lot of institutions around the world. Recently, I went to a design school in Singapore, and they were very excited to talk about how the very first project they do with design students is how to do all their ideation using AI, and a very kind of positive, and really very much focused on, well, all of these young people are going to go into jobs of the future that's going to use AI, so we need to build that in right from the get-go. So I didn't feel that sense of a lack of trust in other contexts, really more in Asian countries. I'm just wondering if that crisis is more on this sort of land?
Yeah, I'm trying to talk very specifically about UK higher education and UK society. Because yeah, I mean the UK is not in a good place after Brexit.
Fair enough.
to put it and so like I don't know that kind of comparative data well at all, but like my understanding is that on most measures, social trust is higher in kind of wealthy Southeast Asian societies. I mean, China's an interesting case because I think there are a lot. Most of my students are from China, and there's a lot of conflict. I think it's quite a complex relationship to trust
Sure.
in that environment. But the kind of case you're talking about, my understanding is that that is a relatively high trust society.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, just sort of reflecting on some of the things we're saying, that I mean, I was particularly triggered by that first thing about the academic being all kind of like dewy-eyed about the beautiful, joyful experience of, teaching that has been blown to bits. And just the complete lack of understanding of what we're actually doing here is trying to prepare people for their futures, and it's not about your own academic bliss. And that just seems very, very irritating. And so I think there's a lack of trust that I see in this. It's I think young people at university are probably right to not trust the intentions of their teachers if they're dewy-eyed about their own previous experience of what academia used to be like, rather than their futures.
Yeah, there's an amazing PhD thesis by the social theorist Jana Bacevic, which I don't think she's ever actually published, which is a shame. But about kind of academic reflexivity and kind of the tendency for academics, they, to tell themselves stories that are comforting. And it's one of those things that after I read it, it's like I can never look at the profession the same way again, because that's another example that academics, we are prone to centering ourselves stories about the university, and we take ourselves very seriously, and that leads to outlooks like the one I was pointing to. Go for it.
Thank you so much. I've got a few comments and kind of a few thoughts, and some of them resonate with what Rochelle said. So first of all, when you're talking about the crisis of trust, and of course I was a sociologist, I was thinking of Raymond Williams' structure of feeling, right? Which is a kind of, the concept, right? When we think about the structural and the deeply emotional, deeply personal. And I think it's worth kind of thinking about that way beyond the context of education, as you pointed out, and kind of way beyond the specific instances of AI-induced hallucination, because, we are now in almost a decade of fake news, so-called. I mean, it existed way before, but they labeled its own fake news. So there is something that's been building up for quite a long time. And we're thinking both globally and cross-culturally and cross-politically at various structures of trust. And of course, I'm thinking, you mentioned Chinese students. I'm thinking about Soviet upbringing and kind of the idea that you trust, say, the government, was never on the table. So even the assumptions that we make about who we can and should trust, or like trust your teachers, or trust your parents, or trust your elders. So we need to kind of take a step back and start unpacking these. And then once we've done that, come back to AI. And I wonder whether we should think about the current time as a sort of transitional moment, which is very uncertain. A lot of things are happening. And it's not that we know what is going to happen, but what if we take it not as the moment of absolute crisis, but a sort of transition, and start thinking about what are we transitioning from and what are we transitioning towards, specifically from the perspective of history of technology. So we were just having a discussion over the break about the kind of anxieties around the emergence of print. And what is being lost, what is being gained. So it looks like we're in that transitional moment where some fundamental skills are disappearing. Something new possibly is emerging. And I'm not glamorizing AI at all. But I wonder kind of what your thoughts are as a sociologist, more broadly beyond the drama of our students and their fake essays and ChatGPT giving wrong answers. Don't forget that young people asking him are already the Google generation that have gone to Google for everything. So what are your thoughts on this transitional moment and the kind of structures of feelings that might emerge? And what do we do with that?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. Thank you. I mean, in terms of the kind of the socio-technical infrastructure of society, I completely take your point that you know, any transition in that apparatus, if you take it at the midway point, will seem chaotic. And so, like, yeah, in that sense, I'm in full agreement. The thing that worries me though is the sense that epochally we're at a kind of point where the capacity of the social order to stabilize may itself be breaking down. And so the capacity of the kind of the global system to find a new mode of ordering itself might not be feasible. That, you know, it's almost like we've had stuttering starts in a transition from, to, you know, we see like 2001, so 9/11 and the financial crisis and way. I think Zizek once talked about it as the kind of 1-2 punch of history, and that between those two events, there was a shift away from the previous regime. But we've kind of been in a holding pattern societally since then. And then COVID seems to have been the thing that led to significant disruption. And, you know, there's lots of literature on post-neoliberalism, which I think there's certainly something to that. But my worry is that, well, firstly, if a new kind of social order is emerging, it's worse than neoliberalism, which was pretty bad. But also the bigger fear is that something new might not be emerging, that the capacity of the global system to cope with the shocks it generates is breaking down. And I'm thinking particularly economically here. I mean, there's a developing line of political economy that argues that the climate crisis is inherently inflationary. So things get more expensive when there are recurrent climatic shocks. And, you know, think about the energy crisis and the relationship to the Ukraine war and what effect that's had politically across Europe. You know, kind of 1 million Syrian refugees and an energy crisis has driven most major European states towards fascism. And I would have hoped it would take more external pressure to kind of tip historical liberal democracies into far-right states. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, there is obviously much more to it. I mean, yeah. There was a question also from a kind of, I think almost a follow-up from one of the attendees online. It's really a situation, as you say, trust lost on all sides. Everyone and everything has become artificial. Could it perhaps also be that what we feel is that we have lost power as teachers and academics? So it's a different spin on what you're saying. So are we experiencing this a moment of powerlessness?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think there's many drivers of anxiety, but one is the professionalization. We have less control than we did over what we do and how we do it. And, you know, when your sense of control is declining, it generates anxiety when you look for explanations for that. The kind of psychoanalytical side of this is very underdeveloped, but it's something I really want to explore in the future. I've been reading a lot of the Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, particularly in the last couple of years, because I think there's something going on about anxiety and how it's managed and how technology mediates anxiety. And, you know, we work in increasingly platformized universities as well, and there's lots of control inherent in that. You know, the platform offers us convenience, but also it frustrates us at the same time. And the kind of parameters of everyday working life have shifted in so many ways. And, you know, I guess concretely, my hunch is that some academics are taking the anxiety generated by all these many causes, bundling it up, and then saying ChatGPT is making work feel weird, and I wish ChatGPT would go away. As a practical claim, like, I don't know how to substantiate that, but like, I like it as a hunch.
Another more question.
Well, I'd be curious. I mean, do those characterizations of a lack of trust resonate?
Can I just say something in relation to Copilot, my favorite? We use that, I've used it with 2 different core classes in first year. So one on methods and the other on social theory. And I've used it in the way that I'm deliberately telling them they can use it for specific parts of the assessment. But it's really rubbish and it doesn't do what they ask it to do. And then I tell them, write a reflection on it, show me the prompts, and then they get frustrated and abandon it and then do their own image, which is really great. So it means they're critical users and they've asked it, they've tried 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and the image is getting worse and it's giving them fake words and bad spellings, and then they abandon it. Some keep it in, but it's not a great visualization, but it's definitely teaching them to be critically involved with it. So the fact that the tool is rubbish is actually quite good.
I really like that way of looking at it, and that kind of makes me want to try using Copilot with my students because, yeah, we've got our program. We've got a style of teaching where we look at kind of platform failure as a teaching resource, which initially I worried we were just using it as an excuse to rant about how crap the university IT is. But like a few years into it, I do think it really works. You know, we say to students, you'll be working in organizations where the platforms are crap as well. And so by reflecting on how the platforms frustrate us, you can combine a kind of practice orientation with a kind of critical political literacy about the institution. So yeah, that's the first positive thing I felt about Copilot for
Yeah.
forever. Because it just doesn't work, and I think it's going to be forced on us because for IT leadership, it solves the data issue. But like if you try and use this terrible piece of software, people will just say they're using Copilot and then have private ChatGPT and Claude subscriptions. But like if you're used to using Claude in particular, just chronologically, Copilot feels like it's something fundamentally different.
That note, mentioning sometimes these contracts that administrators do. I'm in the California State University system, and ours has this contract with ChatGPT and didn't consult any faculty or staff or anything, and just one day said, guess what, everyone, all the students, all of the administrators, everybody have an account with ChatGPT through your CSU, but obviously lots of them already have the private personal ones. But then they began saying, figure out what to do with it. This will be great. And of course, we did have that same paranoia. The instructors had that idea of, great, now you're just inviting everyone to cheat. You're telling them that it's okay. They're all going to use this for everything. But really, I think they were hoping, or somebody was hoping, that we would use it strategically. I thought maybe that the system was getting some sort of money. The chancellor's office was getting money for this. And actually it was the opposite. But it was like $17 million that the chancellor's office paid to ChatGPT. And then they had all these trainings and things to try to, teach us how to create our own GPTs and do all this stuff. So we did one for the library and trained it on all of our library information for instructional library and stuff. And then realized that actually you have to be signed in to your CSU one to use it. So these instructors have created those new GPTs for their classes, trained up maybe for one assignment, or maybe it's on, rules for their class and stuff. So the silly questions that students had asked, they could just ask in this GPT, but they have to be signed into their CSU one. And we're finding on our campus anyway, that a lot of the students don't want to, they have a fear. Then I find out we only have this access or this contract for 18 months. So now I don't know what happens after 18 months. They paid another $17 million to keep it going, or are we just screwed, or what happens to our data? What happens to what we created in the meanwhile? Can we convert it over to or copy it, I guess, into our private accounts? But it just makes some of the tools that we're using pointless if, yeah, they have to use that, and then they're suspicious. There's a lot of distrust even in using something that is like the object of distrust, but yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. Because I felt very split about those contracts because, for kind of learning design, like I'd love it. Like I'd love to kind of embed it in our program, but sociologically it's really worrying about that model.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that those two concerns merge in what you're saying. That like the platform-wide model can't inspire trust. So it doesn't work for learning development because like people don't trust it. And you can see why, right? Because like, yeah, we don't know about the kind of surveillance that is.
No, and they say that the CSU one, if we're in that account, it's locked down, it's not training the main model and all of this kind of stuff. Our data is private and whatever, it's not remembering it definitely though remembers my threads because I can continue asking it other things and it'll go back to the conversations I've had with it. So I don't know how much it's feeding into the main thing. Supposedly it's not, but who's policing that? And I don't trust our chancellor's office to have looked at the contract and read that and know what that meant, or to look, I don't know, I just don't trust.
One of my summer projects is looking at a system they call Clio. So the way they produce that research, they've got like a real-time topic model running globally on all the uses of Claude. And I find this absolutely fascinating. So it's like kind of meta global AI running on top of the individual instances. But like the surveillance issues, and like I'm now imagining the next product they sell is going to be Clio for institutions. So like real-time topic model of how your staff and students are using it. There was an interview I saw recently with, Otter AI, the kind of transcription software. And so they're doing automated meeting transcripts. And the CEO of Otter was saying that now every week he reviews a summary of all the meetings that have taken place in Otter. And he was presenting that as if that was like, how did he not see how creepy that is? And the normalization of it for him. It was like, kind of 10 years ago, I heard Eric Schmidt give an interview where he described Google wanted to put subdermal haptic implants so that you could get an alert, like a little stinging sensation when you were late for an event. And again, like Eric Schmidt, how do you not see how terrifying it is that Google want to implant you with something that can cause you pain remotely? And I think when CEOs say things that are terrifying and they don't see it as, a no comms person has said, no, don't say that.
Yeah.
Like that's really interesting and shows how this might develop and the kind of mismatch between how organizational leaders might see it. Because a friend of mine was harassed about social media posts by the senior leadership of his university. He did a freedom of information request and he got the emails. And it was astonishing. Like, I just thought that senior university leaders would not have the time and energy to do this. But the VC was like every 3 or 4 days asking, so what's he been up to? Give me a summary. And I had this sense of kind of senior leadership sitting around eating crisps, stalking their staff online. And so I think we should
Scarlet plot.
yeah, well, my point is we should assume the worst.
Yeah.
I think. And that when there's a power relationship, that's when distrust takes on a positive valence. And we should assume the worst about how this could be used and then kind of be pleasantly surprised if we're wrong.
Someone in the chat, Michael says, considering the privacy and research ethics concerns around sharing material with third parties, wouldn't locally running LLMs be an alternative? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and so I think that's the push for Copilot. Like the really compelling institutional uses or ones that you have to have a kind of internal operation of it. I think when it's kind of running it locally yourself, they're just not going to be very powerful.
Yeah.
So the capacity of like something like a MacBook Pro, could only handle LLM with a fraction of the complexity of the frontier models. So individualized local uses, I think, are quite limited. I think they could be used for particular purposes, but you can't replicate the functionality. But universities could get the kind of platformized model. I know of one example, Erasmus University are trying to build their own LLM, and they're putting quite a bit of money into it. It's a really interesting project. But when I've talked to people involved, it does not work very well. And so I think just the scale of compute, the scale of data, the scale of capital needed, I just don't think these can compete with the kind of big four.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about how Copilot is so rubbish. And it's like it's owned by Microsoft, who have probably one of the biggest cloud software, like they run most of the world's cloud software. They have tons of data farms, they have the capacity at the infrastructural level to develop something quite good, and yet they've been racing to keep up. And as a result, Copilot is extremely crap.
Yeah,
It's shocking.
my some project is to try and go much more deeply than I have into computer science of this, because there's a very particular question which level of political economy I think is really interesting about the kind of accumulation between different iterations of the model and looking at that from a political economic perspective. So once you go down a certain path of development, is it hard? Do you have an advantage that others who just trained one model can't replicate? And if you go in the wrong direction with like Microsoft, is it hard to roll back? Because I've mentioned Claude a few times, but in terms of the kind of effectiveness of it, they rolled out their Generation 4 models last week, and they really are quite astonishing in what they can do. Like the fluency and lucidity of Claude 4 Opus is quite terrifying. And it also is taking on personalities in a way that old ones didn't, which is very worrying. But kind of once they had a very particular approach to post-training in particular, they have a kind of virtue ethics approach where they think about the characteristics they want the model to develop. And I'd really like to understand, are they getting more advantage over time by sticking to one strategy? Whereas Microsoft seems to have and Meta are doing the same thing. They're in a bit of a crisis about the efficacy of their LLM.
Yeah.
You mentioned about how the propagation and success of growth is tied to the financial factors in big tech. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. Because my understanding is most of these products are not, they're more than not profit making, they cost a lot of money, so they're not making money back. So I'm not asking you to predict the future, but is that to your knowledge true? And how long do you think they've got before that kind of comes to a head and something got for long?
Yeah, they're all burning massive amounts of capital, and so none of this is profitable. It's a trend who I find a little bit annoying sometimes, but offers the argument that I think we have to take seriously. This is like a subprime mortgage issue. So these models don't work, and they're being built into organizational infrastructure. And what happens when they hit I'm struggling to think of the metaphor. What happens when they run out of money effectively? But I think in terms of the financial crisis in big tech, it's about monetizing a sense of the future. I mean, the political economy isn't really my field, but my understanding of it is with the kind of pandemic economic shock, as interest rates rise, the willingness of investors to absorb a lack of profitability in the short term in exchange for a sense of future domination of the field, the kind of thing that let Amazon, not be profitable for years and then take over the world. That the macroeconomic climate made investors much less willing to tolerate that. And investors were being newly aggressive and assertive in terms of, their ownership of parts of Google, for example. And the CEOs were on the defensive in a way they hadn't been. And they started looking, we're doing efficiency savings, we're laying off staff. And with the generative AI bubble, because it is clearly a bubble, there was a kind of reinflation of future promise. But now it's the sense that this is going to change the world. And by getting on the ground floor, you're going to be able to have that stake later. So it's kind of a return to the status quo ex ante in that sense of tech firms not being driven by the same economic parameters, evaluated by the same economic parameters as other firms. So, the kind of cultural hype surrounding it has a very real political economic function. It keeps us looking towards the future, looking towards what comes next. And the extent to which the leading people here really do believe that there is going to be a super intelligence that will render the rules of capitalism, kind of anachronisms. So whoever cracks AGI will rule the world. We have enough good journalism that demonstrates that the senior people do believe that, sincerely. And so the extent to which that is shaping the decision making, I think, can't be underestimated. There's a weird kind of subculture / cult that I think is taking hold in that sense amongst digital elites that is driving some of this.
Palo Alto is one of the strangest places, and there's we talked a little bit about this at our early day, but the weird confluence of eugenics thinking and other kinds of historic, strange reactionary ideas is still, there's a through line to today. So
I'm getting weirder by the month.
Yeah.
Because they're all obsessive users of it as well. Yeah. And so, we don't know much about the kind of psychological impacts of very regular, expansive use of LLMs. And in the same way that someone like Elon Musk, I think, what's going on with Elon Musk is a complex question. But there is clearly a sense in which he has been radicalized by his own products.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the LLMs will in turn be radicalizing the people who are using them regularly in that sense, because they're mirrors. They reflect to us what we bring to them, and so that they will amplify your existing worldview unless you're trying not to use them in that way. And so I don't know what Sam Altman talks about with ChatGPT, but I suspect it's intense.
On that extremely rosy note,
Thank you.
I think it's probably time to call it. We're 10 minutes over, but I thought that was interesting and exciting discussion. So thank you, Mark, for doing this. So